The dawn came without warmth, only the gray of dying rain and the trembling groan of distant war horns. Beneath a shroud of mist, the earth reeked of iron and rot, and every heartbeat felt like a countdown. Sir Alaric stood motionless among the remnants of his company, watching the fog writhe over the corpses of last night's dead. The enemy was somewhere beyond it, unseen, but breathing, like a beast waiting to strike. A raven circled low, its wings slicing through the smoke that rose from the ruins of a once proud village, now swallowed by mud. Behind him, the young men whispered prayers they no longer believed. Armor clinked. A trembling hand adjusted a sword belt. Then came the silence, the kind that bends the soul. Just before the thunder of war returned, louder and closer than before. When the first horn cried through the fog, every soul froze. The enemy moved like shadows given form. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, pouring from the smoke with banners like black wings. Alaric raised his sword, not out of hope, but instinct. The men answered, a dozen voices swallowed by thunder. Arrows hissed from the dark, splitting the mist, striking shields and flesh alike. Rowan's cry cracked the silence, the kind of sound that belongs to neither boy nor man. The ground erupted into chaos. The clash of iron drowned prayer, and the world became a storm of screams, steel and rain. Yet, in that madness, Alaric felt time stretch. One breath, one heartbeat, long enough to realize that the day had only just begun, and their worst hours had yet to come. The rain became a torrent, washing blood into rivers beneath their boots. Alaric's vision blurred. Friend and foe, merging into silhouettes of agony. A dying man clutched his leg, begging for mercy. Another dragged himself through the mud, intestines trailing behind. Father Corin screamed scripture into the storm, his words devoured by thunder. The boy, Rowan, knelt beside a corpse that wore his friend's armor, sobbing without sound. Every sound became one, steel, screams, and sky, until Alaric's mind fractured into instinct. He swung, ducked, killed, and through it all, he wondered if God had turned his face away, or if he had never been watching at all. By dusk, the storm had quieted, but the screams did not. The battlefield lay still, broken only by the twitching of the dying. Alaric stood among them, chest heaving, sword slipping from his grasp. The enemy had withdrawn, but victory felt hollow, if it could be called that at all. Rowan sat motionless beside a mound of the dead, his eyes fixed on nothing. Gareth limped past with a wound that would not clot, muttering names under his breath. The silence pressed heavy, the kind that felt sacred and cruel all at once. Above, the ravens returned, their wings black against a dying sky. Night fell like a curtain, thick and merciless. The air stank of death, and the moans of the wounded blended with the whisper of wind through torn banners. Alaric sat alone beside a dying fire, his reflection flickering in a pool of rainwater mixed with blood. He could hear Rowan muttering in his sleep, words broken and childlike. Somewhere nearby, Corin prayed over a pile of corpses, voice hoarse but steady. Alaric closed his eyes and listened to the breathing of those who remained, to the silence of those who never would. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "We'll march at dawn." The words felt like an oath, or perhaps a curse. The dawn brought no light, only a shroud of pale mist clinging to the trees as the survivors stumbled into the forest. Mud sucked at their boots. Smoke from the battlefield drifted behind them like a ghost that refused to fade. Every branch snapped underfoot felt like a cry of pursuit. Alaric led the column in silence, his armor hanging loose from exhaustion. The air was thick with rot, from corpses, from damp earth, from fear. Rowan's breath came in gasps, his eyes hollow with sleeplessness. Gareth's wound festered, the blood dark and slow. Father Corin carried no weapon now, only a cracked chalice and a gaze that looked through men, not at them. They were no longer soldiers, merely wanderers haunted by their own survival. By midday, hunger gnawed at what courage remained. They found a ruined farmhouse, roof collapsed, walls scorched, and scavenged what they could. Edric found moldy grain. Gareth tore strips from a rotten ox carcass, and Rowan vomited at the smell. Alaric said nothing. He stood in the doorway, staring at the horizon where crows wheeled over the battlefield's smoke. "We'll rest here," he said, though rest was a lie. The floorboards creaked beneath the weight of memory, the laughter of the dead who once lived there. Father Corin lit a candle and placed it on a cracked windowsill, its flame trembling as though afraid to be seen. Night came fast. The candle died long before sleep did. Outside, wolves howled, or men. No one could tell anymore. Alaric sat against the wall, sharpening his sword by touch alone, the rasping rhythm filling the silence. Rowan stirred beside him, muttering names that no longer belonged to the living. Gareth whispered a soldier's prayer for the first time in years, while Corin's voice carried from the shadows, "Suffering cleanses the soul." Edric's bitter laugh answered, low and sharp, "Then heaven must be full of soldiers." The silence that followed was heavier than any sermon. Rain began to fall again, seeping through the broken roof, whispering like tears over steel. The next morning they buried the dead they could not name, the bodies they'd found strewn near the riverbank. Swollen and pale, Father Corin blessed each with trembling fingers, though his voice cracked before the last. Rowan refused to look at the faces. Gareth covered them with his cloak. Alaric drove a sword into the ground, marking the grave in silence. "No prayers," Edric muttered. "They're beyond God now." Corin turned, eyes dark as the soil. "Then we pray for ourselves." The wind answered with the scent of decay, and the river whispered the names no man dared speak aloud. That night, the forest caught fire. Whether by enemy torch or careless ember, none could say. They ran beneath falling ash, coughing through the smoke. Rowan tripped, dragging himself through mud as Alaric pulled him up by the collar. Gareth's limp slowed them. Edric half carried him, cursing under his breath. Corin's robe caught a spark. He tore it free and kept running, eyes alight with something between terror and revelation. When they reached the clearing beyond the blaze, they collapsed together, watching the inferno consume the forest that had sheltered them. Alaric's voice was raw as he whispered, "We've run from death into its shadow." 3 days without food turned the forest into a fever dream. The air itself seemed to whisper, not in words, but in the low hum of hunger that gnawed at their reason. Alaric could hear it in the shuffle of boots, in the labored breaths that broke the silence. Rowan's eyes darted like a frightened animal's. Gareth's wound had turned black and slick, each step leaving a crimson ghost behind. Father Corin carried his chalice still, but his prayers had grown erratic, whispered not to God, but to shadows. Edric counted arrows that no longer mattered. When the rain came, they opened their mouths to the sky like lost souls, drinking greedily, shivering, laughing without joy. Hunger had taken the edge of fear, and in its place grew something quieter, the numbness of survival. At dusk, they found the carcass of a horse half buried in mud. The stench was unbearable, the sight worse, ribs split open, flesh crawling with flies. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Gareth stepped forward, silent, drew his knife, and began to cut. Rowan turned away, retching, but the sound of chewing soon followed. Alaric watched them from afar, eyes hollow, knowing he would not stop it. Hunger had stripped them of shame, of prayer, of manhood. When Corin finally spoke, his voice was trembling. "We have eaten of death," Alaric answered. "Death has eaten of us, and neither man was wrong." That night, fever struck. Gareth raved in his sleep, calling names no one knew. Rowan's teeth chattered uncontrollably. The rain outside turned to sleet, tapping the broken branches like skeletal fingers. Alaric sat awake, every muscle trembling from exhaustion, his sword lying across his knees like a relic of another life. Corin knelt near Gareth, murmuring fragments of prayer that melted into sobs. "He's dying," Edric whispered. But Corin only shook his head. "No, he's remembering." When dawn broke, Gareth's breathing had stopped, but his eyes remained open, wide, as if still seeing the war that would not end. They buried Gareth beneath a tree older than memory, the roots curling around him like the arms of the earth itself. The ground was frozen, the work slow. Each strike of the spade felt like a confession. Rowan could not stop crying. Alaric said no words. He simply placed Gareth's axe atop the mound and walked away. Father Corin lingered, whispering a psalm half forgotten, voice cracking with exhaustion. When he turned to follow, Edric stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. "You can pray," he said, "but he's gone where no god walks." Corin looked up, eyes hollow, and whispered, "Then that's where I must go too." By the time they reached the clearing, the world had gone silent. Snow covered the ground, hiding the mud and blood beneath, giving the illusion of peace. Alaric stopped, looking at the distant hills where smoke curled. A village, perhaps, or another battlefield. "We move," he said, voice raw. Rowan hesitated, his face gaunt and ghostly. Corin gripped his chalice with white-knuckled devotion. Edric adjusted his bowstring and muttered, "There's nothing left to move toward." But still, they walked. Men not driven by hope, only by the refusal to lie down. Behind them, the forest swallowed their footprints, erasing the proof they'd ever lived. They found the chapel half buried in snow, its steeple broken, its bells long silent. The cross above the altar hung upside down, charred black by fire. Father Corin fell to his knees the moment he saw it, his hands trembling as if he'd found both heaven and hell at once. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wax and mold. Alaric brushed frost from the pews, running a gloved hand over names carved into the wood. Villagers, perhaps, or soldiers who sought refuge before their end. "Sanctuary," Corin whispered, his voice both prayer and question. Alaric looked up at the hollow roof, snow drifting through the cracks like ash. "If this is sanctuary," he said, "then God's walls have fallen." That night, Corin's prayers filled the ruin like wind through broken glass. His voice rose and fell with feverish conviction, echoing against the stone walls. Rowan watched, wide-eyed, as the priest struck his breast with his fist and cried out for forgiveness, not from God, but for God. "He has abandoned us," Corin wept. "So we must remember him, even if he forgets." Alaric said nothing, staring into the fire. Edric smirked in the shadows. "The dead don't listen, priest," he murmured, "and the living don't care." Corin's gaze turned on him, burning. "Then you'll learn," he whispered. "That silence is the truest prayer." The storm came at dawn. The wind screamed through the chapel's open roof, extinguishing the candles one by one. Alaric woke to the sound of Corin shouting from the doorway, his robes whipping in the gale. "He speaks!" the priest cried. "The storm is his voice." Snow hurled itself through the broken door, coating the floor in white. Rowan tried to pull him back, but Corin stood firm, face lifted to the raging sky. Alaric rose, shouting his name, but the wind drowned him out. The priest turned once, eyes wild, lips cracked in something between a smile and a scream. then stepped into the storm and was gone. They searched for him until their limbs ached from cold. When they found him, it was too late. Father Corin lay at the base of a frozen tree, eyes open, face serene. Snow had settled gently upon his lashes as if the sky itself had wept him still. Rowan broke first, collapsing beside the body, sobbing into his cloak. Alaric stood motionless, the wind carving silence between each breath. Edric crouched down, brushing frost from the priest's hands. "He found his god," he said quietly. "Just not the one he prayed for." Alaric closed Corin's eyes and whispered, "No man finds him. He finds us when it's already too late." They burned the priest's body at dusk. The smoke rose thin and gray, vanishing into a sky the color of bruised steel. None spoke. Alaric stood closest to the flames, the heat stinging his face, the smell of burning cloth and flesh turning his stomach. Rowan whispered something. Perhaps a prayer. Perhaps a farewell. Edric remained silent, eyes on the horizon. When the fires sank to embers, Alaric said only, "We move east." His voice carried no authority now, only necessity. As they turned away, the ashes scattered on the wind, drifting through the dark like a blessing no one believed in. They did not see the ambush until it was far too late. The air was quiet, almost kind, when the first arrow struck Edric in the shoulder. He fell without a cry. Another shaft tore through Rowan's cloak, pinning him to a tree. Alaric raised his sword, shouting for cover, but the woods exploded with movement. Soldiers in black armor, faces hidden, their weapons gleaming wet in the light. Within moments, the survivors were surrounded. "Lay down your arms," a voice commanded from the fog, calm and cruel. Alaric dropped his sword, its clang echoing like a tolling bell. He met the eyes of the unseen commander and said, "Do what you came for. We've already given everything else." They were dragged to a ruined keep where the enemy had made camp. The air inside stank of smoke and wet stone. Alaric's wrists were bound with iron. Rowan trembled beside him, eyes darting from torch to torch. A man stepped forward, tall, clean armored, eyes like the edge of a blade. "Sir Alaric Vane," he said, his voice measured. "I remember you." Alaric said nothing. "You fought at Hollowmere. You left no prisoners." Alaric met his gaze. "Neither did you." The man smiled faintly. "Then you understand the price." He gestured, and the guards seized Rowan, dragging him toward the courtyard. Alaric lunged, shouting his name, but the iron bit into his wrists until blood ran. The interrogation began at dusk. They tied Alaric to a chair in the courtyard, the snow beneath him melting in the torchlight. The commander paced before him, his boots crunching softly. "Your king sent you to die," he said. "Ours sent us to finish what he began." Alaric stayed silent, blood pooling beneath his fingertips. When words failed, the beating started, slow, deliberate, without fury. "Tell us your stronghold's position," the voice said again and again. Alaric spat blood into the snow. "We have no stronghold," he whispered. "Only graves." The commander stopped, studied him, and smiled. "Then you've already won." When they brought Rowan forward, Alaric's breath caught. The boy's face was white with terror, his knees shaking. "He's just a child," Alaric said. The commander tilted his head. "So were we all once." A sword was drawn, gleaming red in the firelight. Rowan's eyes locked on Alaric's. "Sir," he whispered, "you said we'd see home again." Alaric's voice broke. "I lied." The blade rose. And in that heartbeat, Alaric lunged, snapping the chain that held him to the chair. He struck the guard with the broken shackle, grabbed the fallen sword, and turned it on his captors. Chaos erupted, shouts, fire, blood, the world collapsing into motion. By the time the flames died, the keep was a ruin of bodies and smoke. Alaric staggered into the open air, Rowan leaning against him, blood staining both their cloaks. Edric limped behind, his bow broken, his face streaked with soot. The commander lay still in the snow, eyes open to the sky. Alaric stood over him, breathing hard. "No more kings," he muttered, and let the sword fall beside the corpse. The wind howled through the broken walls, carrying with it the sound of iron collapsing, the sound of a promise ending. As dawn crept over the horizon, the survivors looked east, where the light touched the edge of the world. For the first time, Alaric felt the weight of his armor, and knew he would never wear it again. They walked for days through lands they no longer recognized. The war had scorched everything. Villages turned to ash, rivers clogged with armor and bone. The snow began to thaw, revealing the black soil beneath, slick and red with what the earth had drunk. Rowan limped beside Alaric, his wound festering but his spirit stubbornly alive. Edric's silence had grown heavier. He no longer looked at the horizon, only the ground beneath his boots. When they reached the burnt remains of a mill, Alaric stopped. "I know this place," he murmured. His home had once stood beyond the hill, a memory buried under years of smoke. The past rose around him like ghosts in the wind, and for the first time, he looked afraid. The ghosts came at night, not in dreams, but in the stillness between breaths. Alaric awoke to the sound of laughter, soft and distant, echoing through the ruins. He followed it to where the mill once stood, and there in the flicker of moonlight saw her, a woman, standing barefoot in the snow. Eyes like dawn, face unmarked by time. His wife, or the shadow of her. She smiled the way she once had before the war took her from him. "You came back," she whispered, "but you left everything behind." He reached for her, but his hand passed through air. Only the wind answered. Behind him, Rowan stirred, whispering in his sleep, "Sir, don't go." Morning broke with silence. Alaric said nothing of what he'd seen. Rowan asked where they were heading, but Alaric could not answer. His mind wandered between now and then, between the soldier and the man he used to be. When they reached the edge of a familiar field, Alaric fell to his knees. The soil was charred but soft, and when he dug his hand into it, he pulled up what remained of a child's wooden toy, a carved horse, blackened by fire. His vision blurred. "They burned them all," he whispered. Edric said nothing, his jaw tightening. Rowan turned away, tears freezing against his cheeks. The world had taken everything, even the reason to remember it. That night, Alaric sat apart from the others, staring into the fire. "I remember their faces," he said finally. "My wife, my son." Their hands were small. Rowan looked up, hesitant. "You had a family?" Alaric nodded. "Before the wars. Before the crowns and banners meant anything." He took off his gauntlet, revealing scars not of battle, but of work, old burns from a forge. "I was a blacksmith. The sword I carry. I made it for another man." He stared into the blade, its reflection warped by flame. "Every life I took, I've seen his face. The man who never was, the one who could have stayed home." The silence that followed felt endless, the kind that only truth can leave behind. At dawn, the wind carried the smell of the sea, faint, distant, but real. Alaric rose and looked east. Beyond the ridge, light shimmered off a vast expanse of water. "Home lies beyond that," he murmured. Rowan smiled weakly, though his strength was nearly gone. Edric adjusted his cloak, nodding once. They began the slow descent toward the coast, each step heavier than the last. The land grew softer, the snow giving way to grass, and the air filled with gull cries. But as they reached the final ridge, Alaric paused. The village below was gone. Nothing but smoke and bones. "Still," he whispered, "we keep walking." And so they did, down the hill and into the ashes of what once was hope. The village they had known was no more. Charred timbers and collapsed roofs lay scattered across the field where children had once played. Alaric stepped carefully over the debris, boots crunching on brittle wood. Rowan followed, silent, eyes fixed on a distant bell tower reduced to rubble. Edric moved methodically, examining the ruins for signs of life, finding none. The wind carried ash into their faces, stinging like tiny knives. Alaric knelt to a shattered doorway, tracing the outline of the hearth that had once been warm. "We are too late," he whispered. Rowan shivered, not from cold, but from the weight of what had been lost. The land was quiet, the kind of quiet that only death leaves behind. They searched for survivors, finding only bones and scorched clothing. Every step reminded them of the friends, families, and comrades who had vanished into memory. Rowan stopped beside a pile of blackened toys, picking up a doll's head. His breath came in sharp gasps. Alaric laid a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. "We honor them by living," he said, "not by dying in their place." Edric nodded quietly. The lesson heavy but understood. The wind carried the cries of gulls from the distant coast, a sound both mournful and cleansing. By afternoon, they reached the outskirts of the coastline. Waves crashed against jagged rocks, spray stinging their faces. Alaric knelt, drawing a line in the sand with his sword. "Here," he said, voice hoarse, "we mark what remains." Rowan crouched beside him, dragging a finger through the sand to trace the names of those they had lost. Edric set a small pile of stones, each representing a fallen comrade. They were few, but they were witnesses. The wind carried the memory of laughter, of firelight, of hearths long gone. It was fragile, but it endured, etched into sand and stone, even as the tide licked closer. Night fell, but the three remained on the cliff above the sea, fires small and contained. Alaric stared into the flames, seeing faces in the dancing light. Friends, foes, family, and strangers alike. Rowan slept nearby, exhausted, his breathing shallow but steady. Edric sharpened an arrow in silence. Alaric's voice broke the quiet. "We cannot reclaim the past, but we can carry its memory, its weight, its lessons, its sorrow, into tomorrow." The waves answered with a distant roar. The stars reflected in the water like scattered embers, and for the first time in years, there was a moment of peace. At dawn, Alaric stood alone at the cliff's edge. The wind tore at his cloak, salt stinging his eyes. Behind him, Rowan and Edric stirred, waking to the rhythm of waves. Alaric drew a deep breath, letting the weight of years, battles, and losses settle upon him. He whispered to no one, "We move forward, not as soldiers, not as kings, but as men who have seen the world burn and still stand." The horizon glimmered with light, fragile but unbroken. Together they began the slow descent toward the unknown, leaving the ashes of valor behind, carrying its memory into the dawn of a new day.